I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Susan Willis-Chan. Dr. Willis-Chan is a farmer and a researcher at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and she will be speaking today about the unique biology of squash bees and how to protect them from pesticides. So Sue, you can go ahead and share your slides.
So I'm really delighted to be here. I'm in Ontario, Canada, and I'm super excited to be able to talk to growers and researchers and pesticide specialists in California, because this topic really does apply where you live. So I'm going to be talking about understanding the squash bee and also protecting the squash bee in California in agricultural settings. Before I do that, I want to take a step back and think about wild bee species that are associated with agriculture. So we have about 3,000 wild bee species in North America, and 729 of them, or 21%, we know are associated with crops. There may be more than that, but this is what we know at the present time. These bees may be pollination services to crops, or they may not be. So in the case of bees associated with something like corn or green peppers or soybeans or cotton, there may not be pollination services involved, but it doesn't mean that the bees aren't associated with the crop. Many of these bees nest in surrounding natural lands around farms, and they also may nest within cropping areas. And because the bees are associated with these crops, they are likely exposed to the pesticides used on those crops. So this is a different kind of a lens, right? We're thinking about crops in terms of bees, not bees in terms of crops. So now the other important piece of information on this slide is that when I did an analysis of which kinds of bees were associated with crops across North America, I found that 54%, or the majority of them, were bees that nest in the ground. This is very significant as I go on with my presentation. So today we're focusing on cucurbit crops. And so just for clarification, what I mean by this is pumpkin and squash, decorative gourds, cucumber, watermelon, and melons. All of these are cucurbit crops. But the focus today is pumpkin and squash, and that is simply because these are the crops that are most closely associated with the bee that we're interested in, which is the squash bee. So in these crops, they're very interesting. They have a new crop of flowers every day, and those flowers open at dawn and they close about noon, and that may vary according to temperature and humidity. But bees are associated with both open flowers, like in number 2, and with wilting and closed flowers, like number 3 and 4. Squash bees, I mean. Pollinators are crucial to pumpkin and squash pollination, and this is for 2 reasons. The first one being that there are male and female flowers that are separate from each other. They might be on the same plant, but the flowers are separated. And the males are pollen-bearing. They don't produce fruit, they just produce pollen, and they also produce nectar. The females are pollen receiving, and then the pollen is used to produce a fruit. Okay, so the females produce the fruit, the males produce the pollen. And what they need is an agent to move that pollen from the males from the male flower to the female flower. And that can't be wind, because the pollen, which is pictured here, that very spiny globe looking thing, is very heavy, it's very oily, and it cannot be removed. It cannot be moved by wind. So it needs a bee to do it. The bees are motivated from one flower to the next because they're in search of nectar, and there's nectar on both male and female flowers. So I don't want impression that squash and pumpkin are only pollinated by squash bees. They are pollinated by a wide number of bees because these crops are very attractive, because they produce a lot of nectar. That's the reason they're attractive. So we find bumblebees, we find honeybees, we find squash bees, and we find many, many small wild bees, and then all kinds of other things that visit, moths and all kinds of other things that visit the crop. However, the 3 most important groups of bees that visit this crop and provide pollination services are bumblebees, honeybees, and squash bees. And here I'm going to argue that squash bees are likely the most valuable of these three groups of bees with respect to crop pollination. So let's move on to understanding squash bees. So we're going to pretend that we're not talking about bumblebees and honeybees, and we're just talking about squash bees. So this is a really nice diagram from Margarita Lopez Uribe's paper from 2016, and it shows that originated in Mexico, and squash plants also originated in Mexico. And squash bees and squash plants formed a very close association on wild squash. They were actually gourds. And what happened about 10,000 years ago is humans domesticated squash, and the bees moved from the wild plants over to the squash crops. It doesn't mean they left them, but they expanded their association. And as these crops were then traded by indigenous people across the landscape, the bee behind. And so eventually the bee moved out of the area, which is pictured in yellow here, where its original host, the wild squash, is present, and moved beyond that into places where that wild squash does not exist. And this is important because it means that this bee is entirely dependent in the green area on this map on human crops grown by humans. So we have kind of a responsibility to this bee, in my opinion. Okay, we could say that humans, squash bees, and cucurbita crops, which are pumpkin and squash crops, are in a reciprocal relationship. We need to guard that relationship and protect it. Now, when I think about the production of squash from plants, I think about what's called a pollination window. And what I mean by that is you have flower production for long periods of time from early July till early October in most places. But the only flowers that really matter are the ones that bloom between mid-July and mid-August. That's because that's when most of the female flowers are available. And mid-August is probably the latest time when if you pollinate a female flower, you'll get a mature fruit by a harvest. The interesting thing about this is that squash bee activity and the squash pollination window coincide. Now, just as a little aside, I did some work to see where all the pollen goes from pumpkin and squash crops. And what I found is that about 13% that's produced by a male flower in squash crops is actually wasted. It's wasted in terms of the plant, and it's wasted in terms of squash bees. However, ants come along and gather it at the end of the day. About 9% of the pollen is all that's needed for full pollination of the crop. That leaves 78% of the pollen that's produced by this plant available for squash bees and other bees to collect to use for their own nutritional needs and reproductive needs. That's pretty astounding if you ask me. Now, why do I think that squash bees are really important in this crop? Well, I think they're important because they are active as soon as the flowers open in the day. In other words, they're early morning foragers. So what you see here is a graph, and you see some, on the bottom, you see sort of hour-long intervals from pre-dawn until noon. You see on the left-hand side the number of pollen grains in the cucurbita system. And, so if we just look at the gray bars, what you see quickly is that pollen is really, really highly available until about 7 o'clock. And then when you move from the 7 to the 8-hour period, you almost have no pollen. And this is simply because it has all been removed by bees. So then the question we have to ask is which bees are removing this pollen? And what you see, so I want you to pay attention to the red solid line and the blue solid line and the aqua solid line. The rest of them you can just ignore. The red solid line is squash bees. What you see is that they're on that crop in high numbers right at dawn. And they are taking pollen off, and although it looks like there's a dip in the population, their population is actually remaining constant from a statistical perspective all the way across the. If you look at the honeybee line, which is the blue line, you see that they're present in very, very low numbers when pollen is at high abundance, and their numbers increase over the day. So what this tells me is that honeybees are there, not for pollen, but for nectar. And then bumblebees are kind of there in low levels across the whole time. The other thing that's important to understand is, are my squash bee populations going up from year to year? Like one year I can depend upon them and the next year I can't. So the evidence that I have gathered is that this is not the case. If you look at the red line again, that's the solid red line refers to squash bees. And this shows that squash bees are actually really reliable from year to year to year, over 4 years that I studied them. You can see the blue line for honeybees. You see something weird happens in 2017. I don't know what that was, but in Ontario where I did this work, most squash growers don't have honeybee hives on their farm. So maybe this is the result of honeybee hives being moved into the area and so flooding the crop in that year. So squash bees are there when there's lots of pollen. So they're the ones taking the pollen and moving it, and squash bees are reliable from year to year. Now, it's really important if you're wanting to monitor for squash bees that you know if you've got them or not. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time showing you 2 ways that you can absolutely identify squash bees on the fly in the crop, and you don't need an expert to do this. So the first one is to look for sleeping bees in the afternoon. So this is when the flowers are wilted, not when they're open. You have to open about 25 fully closed flowers, not just 1 or 2. And if you find squash bees in those flowers, you can be sure, if you find bees in those flowers, you can be sure they're squash bees because no other pollinator species sleeps generally in squash flowers. And this is what it would look like if you found a flower with squash bees in it. And we're going to open it up because the male squash bees sleep in these flowers. We're going to see if there's a bee inside. Oh, look it, there's not just 1 bee, there are 3 male bees sleeping in the flower. They're just waking up to start their day's activities. Okay, I just want to point out that in this video, I'm doing this in the morning, but you would not be doing this in the morning. You would be doing it in the afternoon. The other way you can identify squash bees on the fly in a squash crop is to look for females with what I call pollen pants. So first, let's go up to the right hand at the top. This is a female worker honeybee, and she's collecting pollen. And you can see her pollen is all neatly packed into her pollen sac or corbicula on her hind leg. It is not spread all over her legs. Okay, so that's what a honeybee carrying pollen looks like. Now, in the other 2 photos, you see a squash bee carrying pollen. And you can see how the pollen is all over her legs. That's because she has very hairy legs, and that traps the pollen. And down at the bottom on the right-hand side, you can see a female squash bee just entering her nest with a full pollen on. Okay, so that's a really easy way to identify them. Now, if you're out looking at bees in a squash patch, you're going to encounter both male and female squash bees. And if you look at this graph, we have a running total of the number of bees, and the males are in black and the females are in gray. And this is over the season. And what's really important, you can see very clearly that there are way more males than there are females in the population. As a matter of fact, I think it's something like 2.4 males versus females. So you're going to encounter a lot more male bees than you are female. So it's kind of important that you understand the difference between them. So this is a male squash bee. These are 3 male squash bees in this flower. So the most important detail to understand when a squash bee is in a flower and looking away from you is whether it has hairy back legs. So here you can see a squash bee, and it does not have hairy back legs. So male squash bees don't end up with pollen pants on them. The other important thing is a white I'll call it a mustache. It's a white coloring on the face of the bee that looks like a mustache. And that's the way you can tell whether a bee that is looking at you is a female or male. Female squash bees have very hairy legs and they have pollen pants. And this is what they look like when they're actually manipulating a flower. So here she is. She's just taken nectar, so that's why her tongue is out. And now she's moving up onto the top of the anther, and she's actually harvesting pollen. So this is not accidental. She's literally grabbing pollen from there and putting it in her pollen pants. So just remember, when you're looking for squash bees, you either find them with pollen pants, full of, like their back legs are full of pollen, or they just have hairy back legs. Squash bees are definitely not honeybees. They're not like honeybees in most ways. The only thing that they have in common is they both drink nectar and they both collect pollen. So here I've put a squash bee into this picture of honeybees, and you can see that they also have different coloration. Squash bees are gray with black stripes, and honeybees are black with gray stripes. Honeybees are very cylindrical. So if you took a honeybee and you put it in front of your eye with its abdomen facing towards you, you'd see sort of like a cylindrical being. If you looked at a squash bee, it's much more flat. So it's like somebody has squished it from top to bottom and you get a more flattened bee. Their social organization is very different. The period of time in which they're active during the season is very different. The number of offspring they produce is different. Where they nest is different. And their specialization is different. So I'm going to tell you about all of these. Squash bees produce one generation a year. So that means they don't produce offspring and then those offspring produce more offspring. It's not like that. They just produce one generation and it's over. They're active from July to September, and this corresponds exactly to the bloom period of pumpkin and squash. In that time, they have to emerge as adults, they have to mate, they have to forage on the crop, and then the females have to make nests and produce offspring. This is very different from pumpkin and honeybees and bumblebees, who are active throughout the season. When bees have emerged from their nests, their first job is to first feed themselves. So they have to find pumpkin and squash flowers to take nectar and pollen from to feed, to mature sexually. And then they have to mate. And this is what mating looks like. Remember, there are many more males and females in the population, so it's a bit of a scramble. As a matter of fact, it's called scramble competition mating. So in this case, the male did not mate with the female because the female mates only once. And once she has been mated, she will not accept mating from a male. Okay, so this was an unsuccessful mating. Once females are mated, they then start to build nests. So I'm going to go through the things they do in their nests if you could see them. So in circle A bee is starting to create a vertical tunnel, and she creates that tunnel into the ground. And then in B, she starts to create a lateral tunnel. And I'll show, and you can see in the middle what the thing looks like when it's all done. Once she comes to the end of her lateral tunnel, she makes a cell, and that cell she coats with a sort of a waterproofing that she produces in her Dufour gland. And once that's done, then she'll go out and forage, and she'll collect pollen and nectar from pumpkin and squash and bring it back and kind of dump it into the cell. When she has got enough pollen and nectar in there, she'll lay an egg on the cell. And then lastly, in circle F, she'll close the door on that cell by putting in a soil divider between the cell and the lateral. And then everything will get sealed off with backfilling. So this is what a nest, and you can see the bee is backfilling her nest. And you can see that each of these cells has a mud door, so to speak. She starts at the bottom and she works upwards. The females are at the bottom of the nest, the males are at the top of the nest, and the nest is about 18 centimeters or about 7 inches deep. Okay. She will make about 5 nest cells per nest, so that means she can produce 5 offspring in her life. This is very different from honeybees, who produce thousands of offspring a day. What's most important here is that squash bees, to make one of these nests, handle about 300 times their own weight in soil. This becomes pertinent information when we're discussing pesticides. Okay, obviously you are never going to see those diagrams that I've made you of nest cells, of nests. What you're going to see is holes in the ground with a little, what I call a slag heap of soil around them. That's soil that the bee has brought up and dumped at the surface. So you can see it on the right-hand side and the lower right-hand side. You might also see a squash bee going into her nest with her pollen pants full. So what I say to people is look for these nests. And then if you're eager to protect these nests, then you should start flagging them. And over time, what you'll find often is that these nests are found in close proximity to one another, like a neighborhood or an aggregation. And it's really important, if you want to protect squash bees, that you find aggregations and you protect them. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. The last thing I want to tell you about squash bees is that they're squash specialists. So they cannot survive without pumpkin and squash, because the only thing source they consume is pumpkin or squash pollen. And the only protein source they give to their larvae to grow and develop is pumpkin and squash pollen. And so without pumpkin and squash, you don't have squash bees. Okay, let's move on to how to protect squash bees. First of all, I want to establish that I understand what a squash bee grower's dilemma is. A squash bee grower has to protect their crop against pests, and they also have to protect the pollinator of the crop from pesticides, which are often used to protect the crop against pests. And this is the eternal dilemma that we have. And so I would suggest that the best way to address this dilemma is to use IPM strategies. And so I presented an IPM pyramid here. And it's no good to say that you're involved in IPM strategies if you start at the top of the pyramid. So you have to start at the bottom of the pyramid. You have to, long before you apply any pesticides, you have to use non-chemical management strategies. So these would include, rotating your crop. I'm sure that everybody's already rotating their crop. Choosing varieties that are not susceptible to the particular pest or disease that you have, or are less susceptible. In the case of small growers, if you cover squash and pumpkin crops with row cover, at the early stages, you can actually circumvent most of the damage that's done, and then you just would remove that row cover when flowering happens. And you actually don't have to remove it until you start seeing female flowers being produced. The last thing is habitat protection. And in this case, I'm talking about protecting nesting aggregations. Once you've done all that, then you also need to monitor for pests and pollinators. And I'm not separating these two because I think they should be done together. If you have reason based on monitoring to use pesticides, then you have to make wise pesticide choices. So nesting aggregations, as I said before, what you want to do is mark and protect nesting aggregations. You need to protect them from tillage. You need to protect them from pesticides, especially soil applications of neonicotinoids, and you need to protect them from too much traffic. Okay? And you may not be able to protect every nesting aggregation. So if you're serious about this, find the nesting aggregation that you can protect. And then over time, that nesting aggregation will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and will serve your farm well. Okay, the next thing is monitoring for pests and pollinators. I'm sure that if you are a crop scout, at this point you are using some kind of a tool to monitor for pests, and I'm sure that tool is really great. However, I am trying to find ways to monitor pests and pollinators together. So what I'm presenting here is a tool that I have developed with some collaborators in Canada. It's called Scout IPPM, and this tool allows you to monitor for pests and pollinators at the same time, and it allows you to differentiate between different groups of pollinators. What this allows you to do is know when you need to apply a reactive pest application, when you've reached a threshold for pests, and it also allows you to evaluate whether you've got enough pollinators to pollinate your crop, and whether you have good resilience in your pollinator population. So what that means is your pollinator population all one bee, one kind of bee, or have you got many different kinds of bees providing pollination services? Resilience would mean that you have more than one kind of species. And so the more species you have visiting your crop and providing pollination services, the better it is. These numbers are compared to people, to growers in your local region, at least in Ontario. As I said, it's not available in the US, but that is my desire to get it down to the US, especially California. Now, let's look at the pesticide side of things. When you get to that very top of the triangle and you have to apply a pesticide. First of all, if we look at the toxic load of cucurbit crops in California, pumpkin and squash definitely have the highest toxic load. What that means is the pesticides used in these crops are the most toxic pesticides among all of these cucurbit crops. Unfortunately, pumpkin and squash are the cucurbit crop that squash bees associate with most strongly for all the reasons that I've already explained. Okay, so this should be a cause for concern. And one of the reasons why cucurbit, pumpkin and squash crops are so toxic is because a lot of neonicotinoids are used in them. The characteristics of squash bees that make them more vulnerable to pesticides than other bees, than honeybees, for example, is that they are ground nesting. They nest in the ground. They live in the ground. The females spend their entire lives from larval development all the way into adulthood. Males just spend their lives in the ground as larvae, and then they're not there as adults. These bees are also solitary. So unlike honeybees, if you kill a worker bee, it is replaced by another worker bee because this is a colonial bee. But in squash bees or other solitary bees, if you kill a female, there is no other female to replace her in her nest, and so her reproduction is ended. These bees are also specialists, as I explained to you. So what it means is that they are eating a diet of purely crop pollen. So if that crop pollen is tainted, then their diet is fully tainted. Whereas a honeybee can eat crop pollen and can eat pollen from wildflowers. And so it's got a less tainted diet in a sense. Squash bees have have some protection because they're fairly large in comparison to many other wild bees, and so they have a lower surface to volume ratio, and so this protects them from contact pesticides. I looked at the relative risk among wild bees to pesticides on the crops that they visit. And what we found is that squash bees are in the top 10% for risk from pesticides among 595 bee species. It's not the only bee, it's in the top 10%. So that's also a cause for concern. So I want to bring to your attention, because neonicotinoids are such an issue in this crop with respect to toxicity of the crop, I want to bring to your attention the new California regulations for neonicotinoids as of 2023. And these apply to clothianidin, imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, and dinetofuran. And I'm not going to say much more about this, but you can find this information using this QR code or following this URL. This is information that is not on the label, but which you are still responsible to follow. Now, I have a reason to like and dislike those new regulations. First of all, I'm thrilled that there is a bloom prohibition. So this means that you can't apply neonicotinoids when these crops are in bloom. That's great. I don't think you should be able to apply any pesticide when crops are in bloom, but that's my opinion. But there is an exception which worries me, and the exception is that you can apply soil applications of dinetofuran during bloom. And as you know, that's precisely when squash bees are active on these crops. We don't have any data that tells us that dinetofuran is actually safe for this bee when it's applied to soil. There is no data. So this is basically, we don't have data that proves that it's causing a problem, and so therefore we are thinking that it doesn't cause a problem. I would suggest that that is not the best way to proceed here. The other thing is that applications under these new regulations are still allowed to soil with neonicotinoids, and I will show you in the next few slides how that is probably not a good idea. What I do like is that there's a total maximum combined application rate. So if you apply neonicotinoids foliarly and you apply them as to soil, it's the total amount that you're allowed, you can't apply the maximum to foliarly and the maximum to soil. There's a total combined maximum. However, I would point out that neonicotinoids applied to seeds are not included in this maximum as far as I can see. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. So that worries me. Why are soil applied pesticides of special concern for bees that nest in the ground? Well, in the case of squash bees, they handle a huge amount of soil. So this means that they are being exposed a lot to residues, pesticide residues in that soil. They also spend a long time in the soil, both as adults and as developing larvae. We also know based on my experience and work, that the concentrations of pesticide residues found in soil are much higher than you would find in nectar or pollen, and those residues are found much more often. So I did some work to compare the hazard of soil, nectar, and pollen for female squash bees. And the main thing I want you to take from this slide is that if you have a hazard quotient, and I've showed you how I calculate the hazard quotient, if you have a hazard quotient of greater than 1, then this is a red flag for that particular matrix. It means you need to pay attention. So in my work, I looked at soil, nectar, and pollen in agricultural soils for pumpkin and squash. And what I found is that the only one that was waving a red flag at me was soil. So soil was way above an HQ of 1. It had an HQ of 4.32. And this is because the exposure amount was so great, 300 times the mass of the bee, and the concentrations were so great in soil. The other two did not raise a red flag. Then I went on to say, okay, so because I'm worried about soil, what is the actual probability that a squash bee will encounter a lethal dose of neonicotinoids while she is building one single nest in field crop soil? And what I found is that for thiamethoxam, even if we're saying that only 10% of the concentrations in the soil are actually being transferred to the bee and the rest are being held by the soil, so the bee isn't actually exposed to those, we find that there's a 35.7% probability that a bee who's making a single nest will exceed the lethal dose as she does that. The unacceptable risks in this case would be 5%. For clothianidin, the situation is even worse. We're approaching almost 90% risk of exceeding the lethal dose for this active ingredient. So you can see that I'm very worried about the toxicity of soils for soil nesting bees. Then I went on and I said, well, what would happen if I don't actually look at the soil? What happens if I grow a crop and I apply neonicotinoids to the crop or other systemic insecticides to the crop in the way that it's supposed to be done? And what happens to bee populations? Do they stay the same or are they unaffected? So I applied imidacloprid to the soil at seeding. I applied thiamethoxam as a seed coating, and I applied chlorantraniliprole, which isn't a neonicotinoid, applied it as a spray at the 5-leaf stage. And all of these three were allowed under regulations in Ontario at that time. And I'd like to point out that the regulatory environment in Ontario and in California is not really very different. Then, so these were all treatments in enclosures. I then introduced the bees into those enclosures 8 weeks after the pesticide application. Okay, so the bees were not directly exposed by me to these chemicals. Then I measured nest production, pollen harvest, and offspring production. I did not measure mortality because none of the bees died in this situation. And we see something quite horrifying as far as I'm concerned. When we apply imidacloprid to soil at planting, the bees in those enclosures that were exposed to those situations produced 85% fewer nests. They left way more pollen unharvested. So that means they harvested a lot less pollen. And they produced almost 90% fewer offspring. So this means that in this circumstance, this population of bees would crash. Okay, so we've come to the end of the presentation, and I want to give you my best advice based on, all of the work that I have done and many years of thinking about this, from both an agricultural perspective, because I am a farmer myself, and from a bee protection perspective. So these are the pieces of advice I have. First of all, there is insufficient data about the effect of insecticide seed treatments. We don't know whether insecticide seed treatments are actually affecting populations negatively. And I'll tell you more about this in the question period if anybody has any questions about that. And also, we have no data about soil-applied dinyttic urine on populations of squash bees. So no data does not mean that it's not problematic. It just means nobody has done the work. Work on ground nesting bees is extremely difficult, and so this work tends to not get done. My second piece of advice is that you should avoid neonicotinoids completely, but if you can't avoid them completely, avoid the ones that are applied to soil. Do not apply neonicotinoids to soil. My third piece of advice is to identify and protect existing nesting aggregations from insecticide exposure. If you can do that, and do it in a way that's practical for yourself. Obviously, you can't protect a nesting aggregation that's in the middle of a cropping area that you have to cultivate and you have to grow crops in. But if you can find a nesting aggregation that is not in those circumstances, that's on an edge, then you should try to protect it. And then the last one is to consider creating nesting habitat away from cropping areas within a farm. This can be done. I've seen it done. And I've seen a farmer start with 5 nests and within 3 years end up with 100 nests on a lawn. And my last slide is to show you what can happen over 30 years in a nesting aggregation that is protected from insecticide exposure. All of these bees you see here are squash bees. They're in the backyard of a farm in Ontario. And there are about 20,000 nests in this backyard. So with that, I'll leave you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have some questions. The first question is from Carol, and she's asking, are female squash bees larger than male squash bees?
They are slightly larger than male squash bees. They also move differently. They tend to be slower. They tend to spend more time in flowers, and they're just not so darty. They're not darting around so much. Male squash bees are definitely darting, partly because they're flying from flower to flower to get nectar, but they're also flying from flower to flower to find a mate. And as I said, it's hard for them to find a mate. The odds are against them.
Okay. Our next question is the male lifespan shorter than females for squash bees?
We have no idea. Yeah. I don't think males don't die when they mate like honeybee males do. And so they can mate multiple times. So I have no reason to believe that their lifespan is shorter, but I don't actually have any data to tell you that. And I am the person who knows the most about these bees, and I know so little, it's just embarrassing. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is, do squash bees nest in the same place from year to year? So do their offspring go back to their original?
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't mention this. I alluded to it, but I didn't mention it specifically. So if you find an aggregation with 5 nests in it and you protect it, the next year, all of the offspring that emerge from those nests, so think about it as the next year, there'll be 15 offspring that emerge from those nests. They will tend to nest again in the same place. So you go from 5 to 15 to 15 times 5 in the third year. So you get these big aggregations quickly over time if you protect the nests, which is why I think that's the best way to protect squash bees.
Okay, thank you. And then another participant is asking, can you share about how farmers who rotate their cucurbit crops impact squash bees? Does tilling and replanting of a new crop negatively impact them? And how do they find the new cucurbit field? It's a lot of questions.
That's a great question that I ask myself all the time, because we do encourage rotation. So in Ontario, the farms that grow pumpkin and squash are also growing many other crops, and so they're rotating within a farm. And so the bees seem to have zero problem waking up in the summer and emerging from their cells and finding themselves in the middle of a sweet corn field, right? Like that picture I showed. They can then go and find the cucurbits around them. And they seem to have zero problem doing that within a 100-acre farm. I know of many farms that are in this situation. However, if they had to move, 4 kilometers to find squash and pumpkin, they might not be so successful. We don't actually know yet how far they can migrate, but we do know that they're very, very successful at finding pumpkin and squash. So, for example, if somebody starts growing pumpkin and squash, in their backyard for the first time, it's not unusual for them to have squash bees on their pumpkin and squash flowers. So we know, and this is probably an olfactory thing. So we know that pumpkin and squash produce volatile chemicals, and those volatile chemicals can cause streams, like chemical streams, over 30 miles, 30 kilometers. And so I think squash bees are attuned to this because they have to find squash and pumpkin to live. So they are able to pick up those things, but we're guessing that we don't actually have this information or this data.
Wonderful. We have a lot of questions. One person asked, what is the lifespan of a squash bee compared with a honeybee?
We also don't know. I'm sorry, I wish I could answer this question. I've asked this question myself many times. Our problem is that it's very difficult to monitor individual bees over time. So I can monitor populations, but individual bees are much more difficult, because if I can put a red dot on a bee, but as she goes in and out of her nest, that red dot often gets rubbed off, and so I lose track of her very quickly. So it is a question I'm trying to think about, but I have not found any smart way of answering the question. I know, for example, I do know that they don't live longer than a month, because once squash are not in bloom, they die of starvation. Yeah.
Okay. And then some squash farmers use plastic covering under their squash plants. Does this hinder squash bee nesting and pollination? Does this help with pesticide impacts by preventing it from going into the soil?
Okay, so you're talking about, does this reduce the pesticide? Like if you're applying pesticides on the foliarly to the crop, it reduces the entrance into the soil. I would say absolutely, that would be my guess. I've never done this work. What happens in these cases where you have black plastic and then the plants planted into the black plastic is there's often area between the plants, between the rows, that is not under plastic, and the bees can nest there, or they can nest in the outskirts of the field, like on the edges of the field. So I don't think using black plastic eliminates pollination by squash bees. Yeah, I would say that it probably has very little effect. They just make different choices about nesting.
Okay. Our next question is from Dawn, asking, what are some of the best ways to attract squash bees to nest?
Yeah, again, I wish I know. The best way I know is to have squash plants. I mean, that's the only way I know. So if you've got squash plants, you will attract squash bees. And I don't know how to make them go and nest in any particular place. I've tried many things and none of them have worked. So you have to take the kind of approach of finding out where they nest and then protecting that area, rather than making a nice little area for them and then expecting them to move in. It's not necessarily going to work. I mean, I've never had any luck with it, and I've tried many times. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I'll also add, when I've gone out to the squash fields in California, I've noticed that sometimes you can move the leaves of the squash that are on the ground, and the nests will be under the leaves. So
Hmm.
be
Yeah,
careful to check. It's really fascinating though where they love to nest, right under the crop.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. So let's move on to the next one. We got, I don't know if we'll get to all of these, but we'll try. Do squash bees have a preference or aversion to any particular soil textures? Will they avoid heavy clays or choose sandy loams?
Yeah, they prefer a sandy loam. Yeah, that's their favorite because pure sand doesn't hold together very well. And so it's difficult to make that vertical tunnel and the lateral tunnels, whereas loam will hold together. Um, it's much more difficult in clay soils. It's harder to deal with. They tend to flood. They tend to get brick hard if it's dry. And when I monitor on farms in Ontario, I find that the biggest populations are on farms that have less clay. So they're more loamy in nature, in texture.
Okay. I'm gonna try and choose the ones we haven't covered yet. Um, so would a cucurbit crop be successful when squash bees are not present?
Not necessarily. I mean, not they. It's. I'm going to answer this question. I'm going to say that sentence because what I'm saying right now doesn't make any sense. If squash bees are not present and you have honeybees or bumblebees, they can provide pollination services. My guess is that if you have a squash crop, you likely have squash bees. That's my experience. If you've got an acre of pumpkins or more, you likely have squash bees, unless you're killing them all. But yeah, I don't. I have looked at, like, I've done a survey of squash and pumpkin farms across Ontario, and below us, because we're quite north, so below a certain latitude, they all have pumpkin and squash. They all have squash bees on them. Yeah, so it's kind of like they go hand in hand. It's kind of a no-brainer situation. Yeah.
Okay. And then one participant asks, are ground nesting female bees unable to sting?
Ah, no, they are able to sting. But their sting is nothing like a bumblebee sting or a wasp sting or a honeybee sting. They just don't have that punch. And unlike honeybees, they don't have a barbed stinger, so they don't stick their stinger in you and then pump venom into you, which is what happens with honeybees. These guys, they poke you and you kind of go ow, and then it's over. Like it's like somebody pricking you with a little tiny pin. It's irrelevant. I handle squash bees, female squash bees, all the time, and often I don't get anything, but it is possible that they can sting you. They have to be able to sting because they have to be able to protect their nests from other bees that are cuckoo bees. So there are bees that'll fly into squash bee nests and take their eggs out and put the cuckoo bee egg in and kind of usurp the nest. And so squash bees have to be able to defend themselves. Females do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we have so many. I'm gonna do one more question, and then we'll add the
Okay.
test link to the chat. Um, so we have, let's see. Are there known issues with squash bees when using post-emergent herbicides like glyphosate or tricloper when treating field rough vegetation borders or field roadsides outside of squash crop fields?
So that analysis I did of which matrix was the worst for bees. I analyzed everything in there, so I didn't give you this information, but herbicides come in as very, very low toxicity. So if I were going to worry about something, this is the last thing I'd worry about because neonicotinoid use is so ubiquitous. That is the thing that I would worry about. Yeah. I'm not saying that glyphosate is a great substance. It has many problems, but it is not the top or the priority problem for the squash bees.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sue, for presenting today. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope you learned a lot and enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your winter time. Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed your presentation so much, Sue. It's fantastic.
Thank you. It was fun to do. Okay, see you guys later.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, okay, bye-bye.
Bye.